The air in the Copa room of the Sands Hotel, Las Vegas, 1960, hung thick with cigarette smoke and the low hum of 100 conversations. Ice clinked in glasses, a rhythmic counterpoint to the smooth jazz flowing from the stage. Dean Martin, cool as ever, held the microphone with an easy grace, his voice a warm velvet blanket over the room. He was mid-song, a familiar tune, delivered with that effortless charm that made everyone feel like he was singing just to them. The spotlight caught the glint in his eye as he leaned into a note, a master at work, owning the room without seeming to try. Down at a ringside table, a man known only as the Boss sat surrounded by his usual entourage. He was a presence, large and loud, his laughter often cutting through the music, his every move demanding attention. Tonight, his eyes were fixed on Dean, a critical, almost challenging stare, and then he did it. Right in the middle of Dean's performance, cutting through the melody like a shard of glass, the Boss's voice boomed. He made a crass, deeply disrespectful remark about Dean's recently deceased mother. The music didn't stop, but the room stiffened. A collective gasp, unheard but felt, seemed to suck the oxygen out of the space. Heads turned, eyes wide, darting from the Boss to Dean. The musicians faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny skip in the rhythm, then recovered, playing on. But the lightness had gone from their notes. Dean Martin paused. The microphone was still in his hand, his eyes, previously sparkling with performance, now held a serene, almost imperceptible shift. No yell, no angry words, no direct confrontation. He took a slow breath, his chest barely moving, a quiet moment that stretched into an eternity. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, a gesture so subtle it was almost missed, he brought the microphone back to his lips. His voice, still calm, still smooth, carried clearly over the sudden, uneasy quiet. "You know," he said, a faint, almost sad smile playing on his lips, "I always thought you were a man of taste. Guess I was wrong." The crowd, initially tense, was momentarily stunned. It wasn't a joke, not really. It was an understatement so perfect, so perfectly timed, that it hit harder than any shouted insult. It subtly highlighted the Boss's lack of class, turning the aggression back on him, making his crude remark a reflection of his own character, not Dean's mother. The dignity in Dean's voice, the quiet power behind those few words, silenced the room in a way the Boss never could. The Boss's face, usually ruddy with confidence, flushed a deep crimson. It was a mix of surprise and suppressed rage. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The usual boisterous energy of his table noticeably deflated. The laughter died, replaced by a quiet unease that settled over them like a shroud. His men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding his gaze, avoiding Dean's. The full weight of this public humiliation, though, remained unseen, simmering beneath the surface. In that moment, a quiet dignity spoke louder than any threat. Dean offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the bandleader, and the music swelled, picking up exactly where it had left off, but now carrying an undercurrent of unspoken power. The Boss remained, a rigid figure at his table, but his presence had shifted, diminished. The question lingered in the smoky air. What would be the true cost of that public slight? Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The Las Vegas of the 1950s and 60s wasn't just a city, it was a stage, a shimmering mirage in the Nevada desert, built on dreams, desperation, and a healthy dose of organized crime. Neon lights painted the night sky, promising fortunes and endless entertainment. Inside the grand casinos and showrooms, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, the clinking of glasses, and the constant murmur of voices. Jazz notes drifted from stages, mingling with the whir of slot machines. It was a place where stars were made, legends were born, and fortunes were won and lost with dizzying speed. Beneath the glitz, though, lay a complex web of power. The men who ran the town, the bosses, held sway not just over the gaming tables, but over careers, reputations, and sometimes lives. Dean Martin, the man who had just silenced one of these powerful figures with a few quiet words, came from a world far removed from this opulent spectacle. Born Dino Paul Crocetti in Steubenville, Ohio, his early life was marked by working-class struggles. His father, an Italian immigrant, was a barber. Dean's roots were deep in the Italian-American community, a place where family, respect, and tradition were paramount. He spoke only Italian until he started school. This background instilled in him a profound sense of loyalty and an unwavering respect for his heritage, especially for his mother, Angela. She was the anchor of their family, a steady presence who taught him the value of dignity and quiet strength. His journey from boxing rings and steel mills to the dazzling stages of Vegas was a testament to his talent, sure, but also to a resilience forged in simpler, harder times. In Vegas, the atmosphere was electric, a constant hum of anticipation and excess. Iconic venues like the Sands, the Copa Room, and the Sahara were temples of entertainment. Performers like Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra, and Sammy Davis Jr. were kings, their names synonymous with the city's allure. Yet, even kings had to navigate the unspoken rules. Reputation was everything, and respect was currency. There was a delicate dance between the artists and the powerful figures who frequented their shows, a constant awareness of who held the real power in any given room. The clinking of ice in expensive drinks, the soft rustle of silk gowns, the hushed conversations at ringside tables, it all contributed to an ecosystem where deference was expected, and perceived slights could have serious consequences. Figures like the boss were an integral part of this landscape. They weren't just patrons. They were proprietors, investors, and enforcers. Their influence stretched far beyond the casino floor, touching every aspect of the city's operations. They expected to be treated with absolute deference, their whims catered to without question. Their presence alone commanded a certain fear, a quiet respect that performers learned to acknowledge. Everyone knew who they were, even if their names weren't shouted from the headlines. They were the men behind the curtain, pulling the strings, and their approval could make or break a career. For performers, this meant a constant tightrope walk. They had to maintain their artistic integrity, deliver captivating performances, all while subtly acknowledging the power in the room. Dean, with his effortless, cool, and understated charm, was particularly adept at this. He had a reputation for unwavering composure, a quiet strength that allowed him to navigate challenging situations without ever losing his cool. Even in the face of demanding patrons or unexpected disruptions, Dean remained Dean, smooth, professional, and always in control. This quiet resilience, born from his humble beginnings and deep family values, was already a hallmark of his character long before that fateful night in the Copa Room. The smooth veneer of Las Vegas often hid a darker undercurrent, a constant pressure that simmered beneath the surface of the glitz and glamour. The incident at the Copa Room, when Dean Martin faced down the boss, wasn't a sudden spark in a peaceful night. It was the culmination of countless small indignities, a slow build-up of disrespect that had been chipping away at the performers and the very spirit of the town. These weren't always direct threats. Sometimes they were far more subtle, more insidious. There were the calls, for instance, late-night demands for a performer to appear at a private party, even after a grueling show. It wasn't an invitation, it was an expectation. To refuse meant risking a powerful figure's displeasure, and in Vegas, displeasure could lead to a sudden lack of bookings, a quiet word passed around that could end a career. Dean, like many others, had faced these disguised humiliations. He'd shown up, always impeccably dressed, always charming, but with an inner resolve that kept him from being truly subservient. He understood the game, but he never truly played it on their terms. Then there were the broken promises. Deals made over expensive dinners, handshake agreements for appearances, or collaborations that would mysteriously evaporate. Artists, musicians, and even some club managers found themselves in difficult positions, left holding the bag, while the powerful figures moved on without a second thought. It highlighted the inherent imbalance of power, the vulnerability of those whose livelihoods depended on the whims of a select few. Dean had seen friends and colleagues suffer these slights, the quiet frustration and helplessness that followed. He learned to trust his gut, to value loyalty above all else, because he knew how easily it could be betrayed. The general atmosphere was one of unchecked power. Certain influential patrons would disrupt performances with loud conversations, demanding personal service from staff who scurried to obey. They'd belittle waiters, bartenders, or even fellow patrons, their arrogance a constant low-level hum in the background. It created a climate of unease, a sense that anyone could be targeted at any moment. For the performers, it meant constantly being on guard, trying to deliver their best while navigating this minefield of egos. Dean, with his cool demeanor, would often simply observe. He kept his eyes on the audience, his focus on his craft, but nothing escaped his notice. Throughout these episodes, Dean Martin's consistent response was one of quiet observation and dignified withdrawal. He never made a scene, never raised his voice. If a table was getting too rowdy, he'd perhaps shift his gaze, a subtle message in his eyes, but he wouldn't engage directly. He maintained his professional composure, his effortless charm, a shield against the chaos. This earned him immense respect from his peers, who saw him as a steady anchor in a turbulent world. Even some of the more discerning, powerful figures, those who valued a certain kind of class, grudgingly acknowledged his unwavering poise. They might not have liked his independence, but they couldn't deny his presence. The cumulative emotional toll of this environment was real. Every late-night call, every broken promise, every public display of arrogance contributed to a growing sense of frustration. The incident in Part 1 was not an isolated outburst, some random act of disrespect. It was the final straw, the moment when the long-standing pattern of entitlement from powerful figures finally pushed against Dean's deeply held personal values, striking at the very core of who he was. It was a pressure cooker, and the boss had just turned up the heat. The tension in the Copa room had been building for weeks, a thick, almost visible fog that settled over the tables whenever the boss made his entrance. His presence was a strategic move, his usual table always front and center, a constant reminder of his power. His gaze, often fixed on Dean, was less about admiration and more about ownership. A palpable pressure that made the air heavy. It was like a slow-burning fuse, everyone waiting for the inevitable explosion. Backstage, the whispered conversations among the crew, the musicians and other performers grew more frequent, more urgent. "He's getting bolder," a trumpet player muttered to the drummer one night, wiping sweat from his brow. "Saw him staring down a dealer at the craps table. Kid looked like he'd seen a ghost." The fear was real, a cold knot in the stomach. Everyone knew the boss's growing audacity meant trouble. No one was truly safe from his unpredictable temper, not even the stars, especially if they showed any sign of defiance. The stagehands moved with extra quietness. The waitstaff walked on eggshells, all hoping to avoid drawing his attention. Dean's inner circle felt the unspoken pressure acutely. Friends and family, aware of the dangers that lurked beneath Vegas's glittering surface, made subtle pleas. "Maybe take a break, Dino." His manager might suggest, trying to sound casual. "A few days off, you've earned it." They knew better than to directly tell him what to do, but their concern was clear. They understood that protecting his loved ones, his reputation, and his peace of mind meant navigating a treacherous landscape. Dean carried that silent burden, the weight of responsibility for those he cared about, adding another layer to the pressure he faced nightly. He'd just nod, perhaps offer a reassuring smile, but the worry lines around his eyes deepened slightly. Out in the audience, other patrons, many of whom also knew the boss's reputation, cast furtive glances. Their enjoyment of the show was often tinged with apprehension. A sudden laugh from the boss's table could make a whole section of the room flinch. Staff members moved with extra care around his group, their faces carefully neutral, their hands steady as they poured drinks. The atmosphere was a strange mix of forced gaiety and underlying dread, a constant reminder of who truly held sway in this city. Every clink of a glass, every murmur of conversation seemed amplified, contributing to the unnatural hum of the room. Dean, outwardly, remained the picture of cool composure. Yet there were subtle signs of the immense weight he carried. A longer pause before he launched into a song, as if gathering his thoughts, or perhaps his resolve. A slightly more intense gaze into the audience, not just connecting with fans, but almost searching, scanning. The environment itself, the incessant clinking of ice, the murmuring crowd, the ever-present haze of cigarette smoke, all intensified the psychological pressure. The Copa room, usually his sanctuary, his stage for effortless charm, began to feel less like a haven and more like a gilded cage. He was performing, yes, but he was also constantly aware, constantly evaluating, constantly bracing himself for the inevitable. The stage lights, usually a warm embrace, now felt like a spotlight under intense scrutiny, making every breath, every note, every smile a conscious effort. He was walking a tightrope, and the fall felt closer than ever. Then came the night in the Copa room. The air was thick with smoke and anticipation, the clinking of glasses a constant backdrop to the jazz music. Dean, as always, was in his element, singing with that easy charm that made everyone feel like he was singing just to them. He was mid-song, a smooth, familiar tune when it happened. From the boss's ringside table, a loud, slurred voice cut through the melody, shattering the illusion. "Hey, Dino, your mama would be spinning in her grave hearing that garbage." The words hung in the air, cold and ugly. It wasn't just a heckle, it was a knife twisted deep. Dean's mother, recently passed, was a private grief, a sacred memory he held close. To have her name, her legacy, dragged into the public light, mocked by this man, was an assault not just on him, but on everything he held dear. The music stumbled, the band faltered, and a collective gasp rippled through the audience. Every eye was on Dean, waiting. The air became heavy, charged with an unspoken demand for retribution, a fight, a spectacle. In that brief, endless second, Dean Martin stood motionless, microphone still in hand. His face, usually so open and warm, became a mask of quiet intensity. Inside, a storm raged. The primitive urge to lash out, to drop the microphone and march over there, to meet aggression with aggression, was powerful. He pictured his mother, her gentle smile, her unwavering support, her quiet strength. He remembered her lessons about dignity, about rising above, about never letting anyone diminish your spirit. Years of discipline, of navigating the complex world of Vegas, of understanding the dance between power and performance, all clicked into place. A direct, angry confrontation, he knew, would only escalate the situation violently, something Dean always avoided. It would give the boss exactly what he wanted, a public circus, a validation of his power. But Dean was smarter than that. He was more dangerous in his calm than the boss was in his rage. A flicker of an idea, sharp and precise, crossed his mind. He took a slow breath, letting the silence stretch just a beat too long, building the tension. Then he looked directly at the boss, a look that held no anger, no fear, but something far more potent: pity. His lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. His voice, when it came, was soft, conversational, yet it carried to every corner of the room. "You know," he said, his eyes still fixed on the boss, "if your mother had heard you say that, she'd probably wash your mouth out with soap." The effect was immediate and devastating. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an insult thrown back. It was a simple, undeniable truth, delivered with the weight of a disappointed parent. It stripped away the boss's veneer of power, exposing him not as a feared figure, but as a petulant child who had forgotten his manners. It was a reminder that even in a place like Vegas, some lines were sacred, and some truths universal. The boss's face, which had been flushed with aggressive confidence, now contorted into a mix of confusion and suppressed rage. He had expected a fight, not a lesson in decorum delivered with such quiet authority. The audience, initially stunned, slowly began to understand. A ripple of quiet appreciation spread through the room. They recognized the courage and the brilliance of Dean's response. He had turned the tables on the aggressor without a single raised voice or threat. He didn't need to shout to be heard or to fight to win. He simply held up a mirror, and the boss didn't like what he saw. In that moment, Dean Martin solidified his moral authority. The power dynamic in the room shifted, quietly yet irrevocably. The silence that followed Dean's quiet words was thick, stunned. The boss's table, a moment before a hub of loud laughter and clinking glasses, was now frozen. Faces that had been flushed with drink and arrogance were suddenly pale, eyes darting nervously. The boss himself sat stiff, his jaw tight, his eyes still fixed on Dean, but the fire in them had been replaced by a simmering, frustrated humiliation. He had been publicly dressed down, not by a rival, but by a performer, and not with force, but with a simple, almost gentle rebuke that had cut him deeper than any insult. Across the room, other prominent figures, some club owners, some powerful patrons, had watched the entire exchange. They were men who understood power, and they understood a shift when they saw one. Subtle nods were exchanged, almost imperceptible. A few discreetly turned their backs slightly towards the boss's table, a silent withdrawal of allegiance. They recognized that Dean Martin had not just defended his mother's honor, but had also exposed the emperor's new clothes. The boss, for all his bluster, had been made to look small, petty, and frankly childish. Backstage, the musicians and crew felt a collective sigh of relief, quickly followed by a quiet surge of pride. They had witnessed countless acts of intimidation from these powerful men, seen their idols bend and break under pressure. But Dean, their Dean, had stood tall. Later that night and in the days that followed, discreet calls were made. Other performers, sensing the change in the air, offered Dean quiet words of support, a firm handshake, a knowing glance. Even some of the boss's own associates, those who were tired of his heavy-handed ways, began to subtly distance themselves, finding excuses to be elsewhere when he was around. The boss's reputation, once built on fear and an unquestioned aura of invincibility, had suffered a significant public blow. He was no longer perceived as untouchable. The narrative in the backrooms and smoky corners of Vegas began to change. He was still a force, yes, but now he was also the man who had been outsmarted by a crooner, the man who couldn't handle a simple, dignified response. His usual boisterous presence in the clubs became noticeably subdued. His commands, once met with immediate obedience, now sometimes encountered a slight delay, a questioning look, a barely perceptible hesitation. The fear hadn't vanished entirely, but it was now tinged with a new element, a quiet, unspoken disdain. For Dean Martin, this was not a victory of revenge, but a triumph of character. His moral authority and public respect soared. He became a symbol of dignified resistance, a testament to the power of composure over brute force. It wasn't about proving he was tougher, but about showing that true strength lay in self-respect and unwavering principles. He continued his performances, his legendary calm now imbued with an even deeper resonance. The audience knew what he had done, and they admired him for it, not just as an entertainer, but as a man. After a show, in the quiet solitude of his dressing room, the scent of stale cigarette smoke and lingering perfume in the air, Dean would sometimes sit for a moment longer than usual. He would look at his reflection in the mirror, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips. He understood that true power wasn't about making others fear you, but about earning their genuine respect. It was about knowing who you were and standing by it. He thought of his mother, her memory a comforting presence, a quiet strength that had always guided him. He had honored her, not with anger, but with dignity. And in the glittering, complex world of old Las Vegas, where so much was built on illusion and brute force, that quiet assertion of self-worth was the most powerful act of all.